Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Tracy. I mean this sincerely. When Tracy first reached out and asked me to come here, I was intimidated. When I was a reporter for the Associated Press, there were three of us in the bureau. It was myself, it was John King, who's now on CNN, and Chris Callahan, who's now the dean at Arizona State, the journalism program, the Cronkite School there. And when I told them both that I was coming here, they were just like, wow, Tracy invited you. Because when we were back then, it was a Tracy Breton sighting. You knew that you were on a big story when Tracy was there. And so it's an honor to be here. I wanted to talk about hiding in plain sight, about stories that other reporters and other writers overlook, because to me, that is the centerpiece of doing what we do. When we're not fiction writers. We can't sit in our room or in our garret and come up with ideas. We have to go out and find them. And as Tracy told you, I've written now a number of books, and all of them are different in their own way. They're all sort of based on the idea. The idea moved me, and I decided to write about these things. And I only half-jokingly say that, well, you heard the titles. My first book was about life. My second book was about death. The third book was about money. The fourth book was about art. The fifth book was about war. The sixth book is about survival. And I'm obviously just working my way up to sex. And I'll get there, I promise. So the reason I want to talk about finding stories and the importance of it, and some methods I use, and some sort of, some simple tips that I hope you'll find useful, is because, again, how essential it is. And first, there's three major reasons why you have to find your own stories, at least three. First, if you don't, someone else will come up with a story for you, which to me is hell. If an editor comes up with a story for you, or someone else gives you a story idea, it only seems like a good thing. In fact, the editor already has in his or her mind a platonic ideal of what the story should be. They've already written it in their head, even though they're just sitting at a desk. And so your job is to then go out and either just live up to their fantasy, and who wants to live somebody else's fantasy? You want your own, or you'll miss. Or you'll come, fall short, and they'll be thinking, if only I had done it, I would have nailed this. But, Zuckoff just didn't quite have the chops for this story, because they imagined the perfect version. The second is because if someone gives you a story, or if somebody comes up with an idea for you, it harks back to the old adage, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish and you feed him for a lifetime. People who are story generators, people who create their own work in that sense, in this field, are never unfed. We're always really well fed because there are always stories for us to do. The third reason you need to be coming up with your own stories is because, frankly, a lot of your stories will, and this is the technical term, will suck. Most of my story ideas suck. They're C+ ideas. They're ideas that will get you through, that will sort of satisfy, they will be a passing grade, but they're not quite refined enough. You haven't sort of, taken that piece of coal and crushed it and turned it over into the diamond quite yet. And so you have to throw out dozens of story ideas, in my estimation, before you get one that's good enough to justify 5,000 words for a magazine piece, or 100,000 words for a book. And so if you're coming up with ideas, if you're constantly creating ideas, you can throw that many more away before you come up with that A idea, not that C+ idea. And my goal is always, when I'm looking for ideas, and which is obviously to me a huge part of this process, I'm always looking for the idea that all I have to do is not screw it up. That the idea is so good, that the story is so out there and so ready to be written, that if I just sort of throw myself into the reporting, find the right sources, drive the work ahead, it's a slam dunk. If you start with a C+ idea, then inevitably you're going to have to do, in the writing, you're going to have to do some kind of crazy triple axel with a double somersault to get, to get the grade you want, to get the story to be what you want. I just want to have a clean skate because the idea is so good. I'll stop with that metaphor, I promise, right now. So what I've found is if you have a story hunting mindset, if you create in your mind a sense of always being working on a story or looking for a story, you can almost not stop seeing them. They're everywhere, and they're hiding in plain sight. And so Tracy mentioned that I was a project reporter for the Boston Globe, and let me tell you a story about a story, basically. And then I'll read a little of the story for you if you'd like. I got a call out of the blue. I had been an investigative reporter, and so first it was great. Somebody fed me a fish. I get a call from a man in West Roxbury, Massachusetts, who wanted me to write about the death of his daughter. His daughter was Renee Kennedy Tiano. She had gone down to Aruba with her husband, and she died there. She had fallen off a balcony, was the official report, in Aruba to her death. And the family, the Kennedy family, had some tremendous suspicions about this, and they asked, would I be willing to investigate this and look into it? And they had gathered some material, but it was very clearly evident to me that there was something wrong, something smelled here. And also, it was a trip to Aruba on the Globe. And so that was, it was November, it was Boston. So I went down to Aruba, investigated Renee Kennedy Tiano's death, fortunately found people who were willing to help me to reconstruct her last day. And if you've been to Aruba, you know that you can walk along the beaches and go to different bars, hotel bar to bar. And she and her husband had clearly done that. I was able to get all their receipts. I knew how much she had ordered at least, if not how much she had drunk. Someone leaked to me the hotel videotape of them walking back into the hotel, and also the elevator video of them going up. And so I saw her moments before her death on these tapes, and she was very inebriated. She was just intoxicated beyond being able to stand. She leans against the elevator wall and kind of slides down the wall because she's almost out on her feet. And her husband ends up, he's wearing just a Speedo, and he kind of grinds against her face when she's in this state. Anyway, I put together all this, and then I also was able to get some police photos of the balcony. And there was an unmistakable butt print on the balcony. He had put her on the balcony to have sex with her moments, and she slipped it. She was covered with oil from the beach, and that's clearly what happened. But we can't prove it. In the United States, it would almost certainly have been investigated as a negligent homicide or a manslaughter case. But Aruba had no interest in writing this up that way. It was probably accidental. He left before the body. He couldn't get out of there fast enough. He did everything wrong. So I'm focused on that story, and I'm really trying to figure out how am I going to write this. But I knew I needed an ending. So I called Mr. Kennedy and I said, one thing that is incontrovertible about this story is that Renee is gone. Will you take me to her gravesite? And he said, sure. So we drove to her gravesite because I was going to use that as the ending of the story. The one thing we know for certain, a scene at the gravesite. So I got what I needed. We get back in my car and I'm driving out, and on my way I notice a man sitting at a tombstone. And something strikes me as odd. Even though I'm completely occupied on just how badly I'm going to get sued by this guy for saying he killed his wife, I'm still in story hunting mode. And I see this guy, and it's really weird. If you have any reason, if you go to cemeteries, you know how people behave. They go, they maybe sit a few minutes, depending on your tradition, they maybe put a rock on the stone, say a few prayers, and leave. This guy was there for the duration. He's sitting in a beach chair. He's got an umbrella. He's there. He just, he's not going anywhere. And I say to Mr. Kennedy, who's that? And he says, oh, that's Rocky. He's here all the time. I said, what do you mean all the time? He's here all the time. Every day, no matter the weather, he's here. So I write the Rene Kennedy-Tiano story, and the day I finish, the day I turn it into my editor, I rush back over to the cemetery as though he's not going to be there. You know, he's there all the time. He's going to be there. And it's great. You don't have to make an appointment. You just show up. And I meet Rocky Balsamo, and I learn his story. And I don't know how many other reporters had maybe been in that cemetery over the previous 7 years, but none of them picked up on it. And here's the start of that story. Freezing rain beats down on Rocky Balsamo. An umbrella covers his head, another covers his legs, and plastic bags protect his boots. Rocky sits for hours, cold and damp, in a battered beach chair. He is 84 years old, and there's nowhere he would rather be. For the last 7 years, Rocky Balsamo has spent nearly every day, all day, at St. Joseph's Cemetery in West Roxbury, morning until dark, morning, M-O-U-R-N, until dark. Rocky is there because that is where his wife is. He and Julia Julita Echeverria Balsamo had been married for 55 years when her generous heart failed in November 1993. She is part of me, so here I am whole, Rocky said recently, his English carrying the accent of his homeland, Argentina. Being here makes me feel better, not good, but better. I do it for Julita and for myself. Some might see him as achingly sad, a depressed man in limbo, but Rocky does not ask to be understood. All he wants is to honor a woman so fine it hurts to remember she was his. And yet the power of Rocky's solitary vigil has spread beyond Julita's grave, embracing dozens of strangers who have happened upon it. 2 of them have begun a love story that might be as deep and lasting as Rocky and Julita's. And then on from there about their background, how they met, and that's a story that I love, and Tracy and I were talking about it when we talked about me coming down. And as much attention as the Rene Kennedy-Tiano story got, this story has lived on. It's been in a number of collections, and it's a story I hear about more from sort of people I run into. You wrote the headline was Endless Love. And I hear more about that than almost any newspaper story I wrote. And it was just a pleasure to report, because the idea, again, it was so good. Then you're feasting at the table because the table's been set. And, going to his apartment and seeing that he hadn't turned the calendar page. It's faded from sunlight 7 years later from the day she died. Seeing that there's pizza she made in the freezer still from because he won't eat it. Finding out that the coat he wears, it's a worn old parka, and he has other coats, but this is the coat she knew him in, so that's what he wears to her gravesite. Every one of these details is just waiting to be found if you're just there and you listen, and then the story's there. So it's about seeing with the eyes of a reporter. So that's really the first tip I have, is obviously always be open to the story you didn't come for. Every time you're out on a story, I want you to sort of see yourselves to do this work the way police officers, if any of you know cops or live with cops, you know that they are never off duty. They are always scanning the world and wondering, that seems a little bit off. That person in line is not behaving quite right. They are off duty technically, but never really, and that's how I feel as a writer. The world is an endlessly fascinating place, and if I just keep watching and I keep looking and I keep thinking about it in terms of where's the story product coming from, it's going to keep delivering. The second piece of advice I give to writers when they ask me, where do you come up with your ideas? Because often they're so different. I've done investigative stories, I've done narratives, I've done a variety, is to conceptualize things that you see. I teach, in a building that has a sign like this at every entrance. Oh, that's terrible. Wait a second. I write better than I draw. I promise. Every building Every entrance to the to 640 Commonwealth Avenue where I teach has a sign like that. And I teach hundreds of journalism students. They've all walked on it. Nobody ever wondered what the hell was that sign. And it turned out that this building is it's a remnant from the days of the Cold War. In the 1950s, these signs were put up all around Boston, and this is an atomic fallout shelter. In other words, they've designated 640 Commonwealth Avenue. If the Russians drop a bomb on Boston, just go to the basement and you'll be fine. So there was a great story. So it's conceptualizing this anachronistic symbol is all over Boston. There are hundreds of them. They keep track of them. They know where they are if they need to revive them. It's a really fun little story waiting to be written if you just keep your mind open to it. And wouldn't it be cool if, is the sentence I always say to myself, wouldn't it be cool if somebody knows how many these are and where they are, and there's a map somewhere. Now, hundreds and hundreds of journalism students walked under that sign and never said, I wonder if there's a story there. To be a writer, to do nonfiction work, you have to always be asking, is there a story there? The next tip is that, to me, stories are like old characters from the Old Testament. Every one should beget another. Every story, when you interview someone, don't leave their presence without asking, do you have any other story? What else is going on? Anything interesting? I'm constantly asking people that on the way out. Because people have stories that they don't know anybody else wants, but they'll tell you if you ask. The next tip I give people is to sort of give up your amateur status when you're reading other work that you like. You can no longer read as an amateur works of nonfiction. An amateur reads for the pleasure of the story, for the experience that the writer is taking you on. But a pro reads two ways. First, if you're like me, you read angry. I'm like, God damn it, why didn't I come up with that? I hate her. Oh God, what a great story. How did I, So you read angry that way. But you're really thinking two things. One is, how did she come up with this great idea? I wonder what begat that story. And second, I'm thinking, okay, what did she do with it? I'm trying to look inside the internal mechanism of the story and decode what the reporting must have been like. How did she get that detail? How did she gain access? How did she decide to make that the lead? When you read work you really admire, don't read as an amateur. Read as somebody who wants to, emulate that. And what is it? This is a line about, bad. We all steal. The better ones steal well. We all steal from each other. We steal ideas from each other all the time. And let me give you an example of that. I read a story in the Chicago Tribune that this is still when I was back at the Globe. I was so jealous of this story. It was such a good idea. I hated them. They ran a series of, I don't know if they still run them, but years ago, late night TV used to run these series run these commercials about adopt a child in a foreign land. For $1 a month, you can save this, sort of save the children ads. Chicago Tribune adopted a bunch of these kids from like 4 different agencies and wrote letters to them and sent their $1 every month or what have you. Waited a year and then went and sent reporters around the world and found the kids to see, did our money really help them? Did our money really reach them? Do they know that we've been writing all this time? And it was just such a smart idea. And it was a longitudinal piece of work where they said, we're not going to have the payoff for a year or 2 years or what have you, but we're going to go do this work. And they ended up finding that one of the children had died. A lot of the kids had never seen any of this money. It was really good stuff. So I said, I want to do something longitudinal like that. So at the time, I was a roving national reporter for the Boston Globe at the time. And so I was constantly, and one of the reasons why I was thinking about a long-term project was I was constantly parachuting in, doing a story for a day in a place, and then jumping out and going somewhere else, and never feeling like I really understood how something really played out and really affected people. At the time, this is around 1998, 99, there were a tremendous number of stories in the media about the decoding the human genome. And most of the stories, though, were focused on there was a race between the government genome project and a private company that was trying to decode it. And it was kind of boring to me. I wasn't a science reporter. I wasn't interested in this kind of horse race approach. But I said, wouldn't it be cool if we could anticipate what decoding the genome is going to mean in our lives? Wow, wouldn't that be neat? And they're promising that if they decode the genome, we're going to know things about our unborn children, like are they going to be predisposed to alcoholism, homosexuality, late in life cancer, mental illness. And what would you do with that knowledge? So I said, why don't I conceptualize that into a story? What if we could right now find people who knew something that they maybe didn't want to know about their unborn child, and see it in this larger context of what was happening with the genome? So with a little bit of reporting, it became very apparent that we already did have that knowledge, and it involved Down syndrome. No one, I can imagine, goes into a pregnancy hoping for a child with Down syndrome. It's just simply, I think that's a truth. But many people find out and then have to face the decision, do we terminate this pregnancy or do we allow it to continue? Well, that's essentially what the genome was promising. We would know all kinds of stuff that you maybe didn't want to know, and you'd have a decision. So with some more reporting and some contacts, I found a couple who were willing to undergo what I fondly call the proctology exam of having me in their life for a year and a half or 2 years. I'm going to be up their butts. I'm going to be uncomfortably in their lives, watching them go through this incredibly personal, incredibly intimate and difficult experience of having just decided, and I was going to be able to go back and recreate a bit of what they had just gone through, but then follow them through this decision to continue this pregnancy to term with a child who would have Down syndrome and a severe heart defect. And what would happen? What would be the longitudinal, going back to Chicago, what would happen a year later? Would they look back and say, we made the right decision, the wrong decision? Would the child even survive, frankly? And that became a 20,000-word series that ran in the Globe called Choosing Naia that later became my first book. This is the lead of the first Globe story. Tierney looks radiant in a new black and white striped dress, smiling and chatting as she pulls it up to expose a gentle bulge in her normally flat stomach. She lies on a table in a fourth-floor obstetrics room at St. Francis Hospital in Hartford. Her husband, Greg, sits in a chair beside her, watching as a technician begins the routine ultrasound test that is their last task before a week-long vacation on Martha's Vineyard. The technician, Marianne Colano, strokes Tierney's belly with a sonogram wand, using sound waves to create a picture of the life inside. Greg studies the video screen, fascinated by the details emerging from what looks like a half-developed Polaroid. An arm here, a leg there, a tiny face in profile. Then the internal organs, brain, liver, kidneys. I'm having a hard time seeing the heart. Maybe the baby's turned, Colano says calmly. Then it appears, pumping in a confident rhythm. She stops the moving image, capturing a vivid cross-section, and Greg remembers his high school biology. All mammals have 4 chambers in the heart, Greg thinks to himself. There are only 3 chambers there. You know, Colano says tactfully, I'm not as good at this as some other people. Maybe somebody else should take a look. She tries to mask her alarm as she leaves the room. The inescapable truth is staring at Tierney and Greg from the silent screen. There is no 4th chamber. There is a hole in the heart, and not just any hole, they will soon learn. It is a telltale sign of Down syndrome, a genetic stew of physical defects and mental retardation. A hole in the heart, in their babies and suddenly in their own. The date is July 24th, 1998, and Tierney, Temple Fairchild, and Greg Fairchild have just entered a world of technological wizardry and emotional uncertainty called prenatal screening. It is a confusing place where even the name is misleading. Abortion screening is more accurate. Most disorders tested for today, including Down syndrome, muscular dystrophy, and cystic fibrosis, cannot be corrected. That means the most common question prompted by distressing prenatal test results is not how can we fix it, it is should this pregnancy continue? Those questions, and then the larger context. Those questions are growing rapidly for countless couples who, like Tierney and Greg, would consider abortion, and then on to the larger context of the story. If I had to write that again, I have two adverbs in the attributions, calmly and tactfully. I would delete both of those because adverbs suck. Adverbs are weak. And if you couldn't tell she was being tactful or she was trying to stay calm, then I've got to rewrite that somehow. But that's a fail. Anyway, okay. Here's the next tip. Know what I call, and this is a phrase that I can't claim totally for my own. It's something that my colleague Dick Lair, who now teaches with me, he's the author of Black Mass, The Whitey Bulger. He just has a new biography of Whitey Bulger coming out with Jerry O'Neill this week. It's called The Min and the Max. It's the idea that every story has a minimum and a maximum potential of what it can be if you allow it to grow up, or if you allow it to be, or if you're given the time and the resources. And the min is sort of real. I'm trying to be realistic. Many of you will not have, let's say, 6 months or a year or 2 years to write a book or a long magazine piece. And so you want to come up with a good idea. What's my life raft? What will get me safely to shore? That's the min. And then, what if I really could build a boat out of this? What if I could really sail the world in this story idea? That's the max. And recognizing a story for its multiple potentials, because most stories have multiple potentials, is a huge part of being a story generator. It's seeing an idea and saying, okay, what can I turn it into? From in a week, if I was given a week and a small budget, or I was given a month, or if I was given 2 years or 3 years to write a book-length project. Let me give you an example of that. And this is not a book project, but this ties in a little bit also to the story hunting mindset. In the Boston Globe, every day on page 2 or 3 of the Metro section, there's something called New England News in Brief. These little news briefs, we call them nibs. That's is the term in newspapers. They're nibs. So they're known at the Globe as NENIBs, New England Nibs. So you go to the NENIBs page every day if you're hunting for stories, and you see what other people left behind, is how I look at it. I've gotten so many stories off these little 150, 200 word stories. It's almost criminal. That it shouldn't be allowed. One example is at the end of President Bill Clinton's presidency, he started handing out pardons like they were candy. He was just signing pardons left and right. And a lot of them became very controversial. Some were donors. And we put in the NENIBs at the Globe a story about a guy who had been pardoned by President Clinton for a World War II court-martial for fraternizing with the enemy. And we thought that was a 150-word story, that this guy in Worcester, Mass. Had been given this pardon. And I was like, that's crazy. So I immediately sort of grabbed it, told my editor I was going out to Worcester, and went out to Worcester. And I read Rocky Blunt. I do a lot of stories with guys named Rocky, it seems. Rocky Balsamo, Roscoe Rocky Blunt. And he told me the story of this thing that happened to him when he was a 19-year-old private. He had been sent by his captain into the local community, the local town in Germany, to find a washerwoman to wash their uniforms. He was 19 years old. He had been in the Army for maybe 12 months or 15 months. And he ended up talking with the washerwoman's daughter and flirting with her and talking. He was sent because he happened to speak German. So he was sent in, and another officer who he had had a conflict with saw him talking and flirting with this girl and wrote him up for fraternizing with the enemy. Because the war, it was April of '45, so the war was still on. This haunted him for 60 years. It didn't really affect his life in any meaningful way. He came back, he was busted, he did KP duty, it was on his permanent record is how he felt. And so he asked for this pardon. So I got to sit down with this guy in his basement where he has war memorabilia, where he could tell me the story of his life and how these documents, this court-martial document, affected him. That was a win. I could write that on page 1. Again, all I have to do is not screw it up. You know, send the photographer out, we're done. But then I get this, wouldn't it be cool if I could find the girl? And again, go to Germany, you know, the Globe's money, I'm going. So I get to work, I find other people with her last name, and there was some of the documents were a little bit off, so it took me a little bit of work. I ended up finding her nephew, who speaks English. I call him up. He says, sure, you come over, I'll introduce you to my aunt. So I go over. She shows me where she met. You know, she barely remembered this because it wasn't that significant, but where she was living at the time. I saw where Rocky and his fellow his fellow soldiers crossed the river and where they met. And then I decided, hey, while I'm here, so I put them on the phone together. So suddenly, 60 years later, this old man and this old woman are talking and remembering the days when they were teenagers. She really barely remembered him. She remembered seeing American soldiers, but it wasn't significant to her. But it was something that was undone in his life all these years. So it turns from a NINIB of 200 words into a 2,000-word story about the GI and the washerwoman's daughter. And you know, fun. Page 1, easy, and the trip to Germany to boot. So I'm going to tell you one more story like that, and then because it's even better, I think. So I'm reading the NINIBs again. Again, I don't have much else going on in my life, clearly, if I'm sitting every morning reading NINIBs. And there's a story in there of about 160 words about a Massachusetts man who has been just been convicted of bank fraud because he fell for, you know those Nigerian email letter scams we all get? Well, the federal government decided that he not only fell for it, that he then went to work with the Nigerian scammers and defrauded 2 local banks. And they charged him with bank fraud and they convicted him. So I said, wait a second. This guy actually fell for one and not only lost his money, is now going to prison for his Nigerian email scammers. And the Boston Globe thinks this is a 150-word story on page B3. Fine. At the time, this is now 2006, I'm no longer working for the Globe, so I didn't feel obligated to write it for them. I got to work on a story. I had wanted to write a story and for this particular magazine. And so I found out that this guy was not just any guy. He was a psychotherapist. He was a psychotherapist who had developed a particular tool, a tool that was supposed to determine people's inner motivations. And he was a deeply religious man to boot. Okay, I've got all the elements. At this point, all I can do is not screw it up, and I can take this anywhere I want. I turned it into a 5,000-word piece for The New Yorker. It runs in May of 2006 under the name The Perfect Mark. Here's the lead. Late one afternoon in June 2011, John W. Worley sat in a burgundy leather desk chair reading his email. And this is very much, if you notice the design, this is very much like the Choosing Naia story. It's a technique that we use. It's in medias res, your Latin. It's in the middle of the action, and it is also the moment everything changes. So just like Tierney and Gregg are about to have their life changed, he is about to have his life changed. That's the writing it's the same writing technique, and it's not, I didn't invent it by any means. He was 57 and burly with glasses, a fringe of salt and pepper hair, and a bushy gray beard. A decorated Vietnam veteran and an ordained minister, he had a busy practice as a Christian psychotherapist, and with his wife Barbara was the caretaker of a mansion on a historic estate in Groton, Massachusetts. He lived in a comfortable 3-bedroom suite in the mansion and saw patients in a ground floor office with walls adorned with images of Jesus and framed military medals. Barbara had been his high school sweetheart. He was president of his class, and she was the homecoming queen. And they had 4 daughters and 7 grandchildren, whose photos surrounded Worley at his desk. Worley scrolled through his inbox and opened an email addressed to CEO/owner. The writer said that his name was Captain Joshua Mabote, and he offered an awkwardly phrased proposition. With regards to your trustworthiness and reliability, I decided to seek your assistance in transferring some money out of South Africa into your country for onward dispatch and investment. And on from there. And it tells the descent of John Worley into this hell of his own making. And it explains that he was not just a normal guy. He was a guy who had developed a psychological profiling tool designed to reveal a person's, quote, unique needs, desires, and probable behavioral responses. So the least likely guy who should have fallen for this, which of course, the irony of that appealed to the New Yorker editors. You know, they loved that. So I can go on. Basically, I've done this at this same approach, just keeping eyes open, thinking about what story, what's the min, the max, what can I make of this? Wouldn't it be cool if? How do I conceptualize this sign into a larger story about disaster preparedness, or what have we done, or have we moved past the age of the Cold War? I've done it now with three of my most recent books, 3 of the 4 most recent books. So, you know, I did a book on Charles Ponzi. It's called The Ponzi Scheme. I did it in 2006, before Bernie Madoff, because somebody mentioned to me, I was in passing, it was back when banks were failing in Massachusetts. Banks haven't failed this frequently since the days of Ponzi. And I had heard of Ponzi, and I heard of a Ponzi scheme, but I didn't realize there was a guy. And he operated in Boston in 1920. So he was in my neighborhood. I was there. And nobody had written a work of nonfiction, a true, complete work of nonfiction about it. It was money waiting to be picked up. And then, you know, when Madoff, you know, hits, suddenly the book takes off even more. It had already been published, and so I became the only Jew who made money from Madoff. It was like incredible. And so that was a great thing. And but that was just waiting for me. And then Lost in Shangri-La, the book that Tracy mentioned that came out in 2011. I'm reading old newspaper archives, you know, thinking about another story that I thought would be a book that turned out not to have quite the legs for it, couldn't sustain it. It was better than a C+, but it was not an A, and I couldn't have spent 2 years on it or 3 years on it. And I came across a headline that said, Glider rescue in Shangri-La delayed by clouds. And in this one story in the Chicago Tribune by a guy named Walter Simmons, it laid out how a plane had crashed in a jungle valley in New Guinea. 3 survivors, one of them a beautiful member of the Women's Army Corps, in a land inhabited by cannibal Stone Age people for whom the Stone Age literally had never ended. And the army was in the midst, at that moment, as this story was being written, of trying to figure out how were they going to get them out before they were eaten or killed or what have you. And they had just dropped in a group of paratroopers, and there was a filmmaker who dropped in as well. And how is this not fiction? And how has somebody else not picked this off already? But nobody had. Nobody had looked for it. Nobody had sort of thought about it with a story mindset. And so that became Lost in Shangri-La. And this new one, you know, shameless promotion alert, great for, you know, birthdays, graduation, Father's Day. Frozen in Time. It's the same thing. It was a story about 3 planes that crashed in Greenland in 1942, and a group of guys who ended up having to spend 148 days living on the ice cap of Greenland over the Arctic winter. And then I found out that the Coast Guard was talking about going to get the bodies of 3 men from one of the planes, was going to search inside a glacier, was going to bore holes inside a glacier. So I called the Coast Guard and I said, hey, can I come? Wouldn't it be cool if I could come? And they said, yeah, okay, come on. It was a little more complicated than that, but not a lot. So I went last summer to Greenland and went hunting on a glacier for a 1942 plane crash, a biplane, an amphibious biplane called the Grumman Duck, with the bodies of 3 heroes aboard. And we started digging and melting down inside this glacier at Koji Bay to see what we could find. And that became the next book. So I'll stop there. I hope that's helpful. I love talking about this stuff. I love talking about the process of coming up with the ideas, because we can talk about writing, and we can, it's sort of a three-step process. There's the idea, then there's the reporting, and then there's the writing. And then there's the bragging. So I guess it's a four-step process. And, but without that idea, you're going nowhere. So thank you. Happy to answer questions. I usually ask them, but I'm happy to answer them. Yes, sir.
I'll spend the $30 on the book, but I'm just curious, did they fly in the plane?
Yes, we did. Yeah. On our last day on the glacier. I'll tell you a quick story. I love telling stories. So everything's going to shit. Everything's falling apart. It's a nightmare of a trip. We're living on a glacier, and the last day there, we think we found, with ground penetrating radar, the signature of the plane, about 40 feet down. And it's just the right size and just the right place. And everything else had gone to hell. And we're about to start drilling down to it. And the Coast Guard gets a call on the satellite phone, the Coast Guard commander who was there with us. And a huge storm is coming in, and we have to get off the glacier immediately. And so they're sending, Air Greenland is sending every available helicopter it can to get us off. And this amazing guy who was the head driller, the head melter, Weegee Smith, said, I'm not leaving. And because he didn't work for either the exploration company or the Coast Guard, he just said, I'm not leaving. So I said, Weegee and I had become friends. I said, I don't work for anybody either. I'm not leaving either. So everybody leaves. Weegee and I stay on the glacier, and as the storm's coming in, this sort of, it's like, it's the last helicopter is going to come and pick us up if we'll, and see if we're willing to leave. And as we bore the last hole, we put it right into the cockpit. And so, gave me something to write about. So, yeah, so we found it. We found the Grumman duck. We're going back, even though I don't need to, because the story is, the book's done. I'm going to go back probably this summer if I think the expedition will go off to retrieve the bodies. I want to finish the work, so I'm going to do that this summer. Yes?
Kind of an intangible question, but how do you tell the difference between a C+ idea, especially a B+ idea, and an A-? How do you make the fine distinction?
It's a great question. The cheap answer is somewhat just experience. Just sort of just that intangible sense of, yeah, this one has it. The first thing I do is usually a few days of reporting. I mean, you don't sort of sit around and say, A+, like that's how I grade my papers in class, but, it feels like an A-. But for this work, you do enough reporting to see, does it have critical mass? Will it explode on the page? And if it will, you then start really even just more refining it, and say, will this be a diamond? And then, even sometimes then, it turns out not to be what you think it will be. But if you get it up to A- range, you're willing to invest. Yes?
Kind of on that same line, how do you recognize a dead end?
Yeah, I dig a lot of dry wells. Yeah, I don't tell those stories quite so often. There isn't just one way, but I guess I'll tell you a story. The story that I was working on that ended up being a dead end was for Lost in Shangri-La. You just sort of realize that it doesn't have the significance. I want every story I write now, I guess I'm in a place where I'm writing books, to be more than just about a story. It's got to have something animating it underneath. That's why I sort of describe them. This one's really, the Robert Altman book is not really about Robert Altman in my eyes. It's about what it takes to make art. And if it doesn't have that animating idea, it loses, I'll feel it. I'll feel it in my gut that I'm not as excited going to my desk in the morning and know that I can make a great book here. Or, even if nobody else thinks so, I know. the story I was working on when I was doing Lost in Shangri-La, shortly before the end of World War II, the Lipizzaner, you know the Lipizzaner stallions, the beautiful white horses. They were there was a breed. They all were. There was one breeding herd in Europe, and the Germans had captured it. They captured them, and Germany had fallen, and I guess it was falling, and the Russians and the Americans were racing to go to see who was going to get to the Lipizzaner stallions, and the Americans feared that the Russians were going to get there and kill them all and eat them, because the Russian army at that point, you may know, was running out of food. And so George Patton, who was a great horseman in addition to a tank commander, wanted his guys to get there first. So the rescue of the Lipizzaner stallions was intriguing to me. And I wasn't sure it was going to be a book, but I thought maybe I'll do a magazine piece, or maybe I'll get something out of it. But it kind of just lost, it just wasn't enough there for me. And that's when I stumbled, and when I should have been working on it, I was leafing through archives and came across the Shangri-La story and just knew immediately that's the one. Does that answer the question, sort of? I know, it's.
I was also interested, and I put the question early, I was also interested in how far will you go in the piece before you give up on it?
Oh, too far. Way, way too far. Yeah, I mean, I'm stubborn that way. I'm a big believer of having a sort of a high ratio of work to product. And so I'll usually get into a sour mood because I've just spent weeks, I've spent months. I spent 4 months working on a book that I thought was going to be a book, and I refused to let go, but I sort of knew I should. But that was four wasted months of my professional life. So I'll go pretty far. But I guess part of the answer is what I've already conceptualized for what the story will be at the end. I wouldn't spend 4 months on a story that I think is going to be a 2,000-word, piece. I would spend 4 days on a 2,000-word piece. I would spend 4 weeks on a magazine piece. I would spend 4 months on a book before I'll abandon ship. Sure. Well, yes.
Where are you? Well, you mentioned quite a bit about leafing through old newspapers and things like that. Where are you doing that?
I used to do it at the Boston Public Library. The microfile room there, I think they still call it the microfile room instead of microfiche, but, and I would just spend days there, days and days and days, and I loved it there. And nice people, and you sort of, you can get lost for hours and weeks there. Now more and more you can do it online. If you look in the Chicago Tribune historic archives, ProQuest historic archives, the LA Times is a pretty good one. Of course, the New York Times now is full text going to, 1871? You can kind of get lost in a lot of different ways. Sometimes I'll put in a search just by date, so I'm not looking for anything specific. I'm looking for a time period, and I'll just read everything that comes up on that date. But I really love doing it in the physical archive, because you also see the advertisements. You sort of, it takes you into the moment. Yes?
Could you say something about your writing process? I mean, do you write like 2 hours every morning, or like how do you?
I wish. I'm a night writer.
And how does that work also with
badly.
Like your day job as a professor too?
Well, first, my process. I came out of a newspaper tradition, and I was sort of formed with the idea that you spent the day reporting, and the late afternoon or evening you'd be writing. And I've never been able to break it. And so the worst thing ever was when I did this book with Dick Lair, who is just unbelievable. I'm pretty disciplined, but he's a morning writer. And he'd get up at 6, work till noon, have lunch, and go for a run. And then he would call me, because he's an asshole, and say, hey, I'm going to send you some pages from today's work. And I'd be, still in like fuzzy slippers and a pink robe, and the self-loathing is rising, and so that's when I would start to write. But I would write every night from like 6 p.m. till 2 or 3 in the morning, and that's how it works with my day job as a professor. That because I write then, it never interferes with my classes. So I do teach during the day, and write at night. Well, thank you. Thank you for coming. Hope you have a lot of luck as writers.